English translation. 663rd contact Sunday the 6th of November 2016. 21:48 hours.
Greetings, Edward, dear friend. It was not planned for me to come here again today, but after what Florina had told me, it was necessary to decide on the matter with Quetzal and the committee, and also to come here to report directly to you. What was generally found to be an implementation in the form of a member's Skype connection with regard to a General Assembly is conceivably inappropriate. Such an action would be extremely destructive and would lead to the fact that a disintegration of the group connection would be inevitable. Therefore, this request has to be abandoned. The whole thing would be so impersonal in this form that no success could be achieved because this connection. Technique is so unfamiliar to members in terms of performing a general meeting that it would create more trouble than benefit. In the way of Skype connections, this may work well in personal circles, but for the performance of general meetings, everyone lacks the necessary adeptness, so that only trouble would result from it. This would also arise because the personal emanation of the individual participants or members would be missing, which is absolutely necessary because these impulses are of enormous importance during a conversation or negotiations. Inevitably, this would lead to alienation among the members, which would inevitably lead to a break in ties in terms of togetherness.
That is clear, and I think it is to be understood, because the emanation or the radiance of man is of great importance in every communication, because it clearly shows whether there is something negative or positive in it, which among other things can also be described as feelings for others, or lack of feelings for others. However, as I have often experienced, the people of Earth cannot imagine anything under the necessity of personal radiance, or even guess that feelings for others or lack of feelings for others can also be perceived as a result. Feelings for others is also not understood to mean what should actually be understood by it, because feelings for others refers not only to the human being, but to everything alive as a whole. And hardly any earthling knows that every human being must create and activate feelings for others in himself alone. Not only by thinking and feeling for himself alone, but also for his fellow human beings, whereby the jumping factor, however, is love. With regard to feelings for others for fellow human beings, however, this is not enough, because true feelings for others also includes nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet as a whole. So there is a need for all-encompassing love for all living things, whereby all-encompassing love for the next one in relation to human beings is probably the most crucial point, because without it, as without love at all, feelings for others is not possible, together with the ability to empathize with one's fellow human beings, and with nature and its fauna and flora, etc. Love for the next one does not only mean love for one's fellow man, but also for nature and thus also for fauna and flora, because these are just as much the neighbors for man as the fellow man. Without nature and fauna and flora, as well as the entire planet itself, no life would be possible, and so there would be no life if they did not exist. So it can be said that first and foremost love for the next one must be directed towards nature, fauna and flora, and towards the planet, and only then towards one's fellow human beings, and in this form of love there must also be feelings, that is to say, feelings for others. This is because real love itself inevitably awakens and activates feelings for others in such a vibrational way that it is transmitted to one's fellow man, nature, fauna, and flora, and to the planet. And if love and feelings for others are cared for properly, then the fellow human being will feel comfortable near a person with deep feelings for others, as is the case with nature and its fauna and flora. These all, the people, nature and fauna and flora, feel effectively well and psychologically jubilant when people with strong feelings deal with them, or are even only near them, show them good thoughts and feelings, and radiate good words to them.
You are always good at explaining things.
Thank you, but thanks are due to your father Svath. For he taught me that it is always important for people to explain something well, simply and in detail, so that they can understand what is said when something is said. This results in fewer questions, which often have to be answered time-consuming.
There is no doubt about it. but what is not understandable to many Earth humans who would have to explain things and facts as a result of their activity so that these could be understood by others. However, many of these speakers and writers of both sexes are not capable of this, because they are of the wrong opinion that statements, teachings, and explanations must be kept short, but that the effectively necessary facts and their explanations are not mentioned, and consequently, no understanding of the matter can be found.
I know that because these people act according to the proverb, the spice lies in the brevity. But that is nonsense when it comes to describing and explaining important facts. These must be carried out, explained, and explained as well as possible so that they can be understood by a person who has not yet understood anything about the matter being discussed. But this can really only be done by a detailed presentation and explanation of the facts, and in fact only by a correspondingly correct and varied choice of words. But this is not taken into account by the speakers and writers, because many necessary and detailed explanations are simply swallowed up and not mentioned. Because the corresponding people who have to explain something through speech or writing lack the necessary ability and patience of explicitly detailed explanation. One can of course also say something briefly and succinctly. For example, if a message is made or an instruction, etc., is given. But if something has to be explained, then it is often necessary that certain statements, sizes, and facts have to be mentioned in such detail and sometimes repeatedly, that it is also understood by people who are not familiar with the matter. If this is not done, then many listeners or readership like donkeys will stand in front of a slippery mountain that cannot be climbed. And I find it ridiculous that those people who do not present a thing in an artful way, but only halfway and incompletely, and in addition extremely complicated as experts, should consider themselves to be so incredibly clever and great.
Which cannot be said of you.
Thank you, but what I want to ask now is, you told me some time ago that in the USA the most primitive election battle ever for the US presidency was fortunately decided in such a way that the majority of the US population chose the lesser evil, thereby avoiding a world war. But I'm supposed to keep silent about that, because the walls in the center would have ears, thus carrying everything out into the world and thus also reaching US America, which would not be good and could influence the election process in a negative way. If certain elements would come to the conclusion that the Clinton would be sawed off and Trump would take over the helm.
It would have been really dangerous if you had told something. Because in certain inner government circles and in certain secret services there would have been very unpleasant and dangerous turmoil if they had learned of what I had entrusted to you. There would have been unparalleled election manipulations as well as life-threatening attacks against Trump, both in the Secret Service and from the ranks of Democratic fanatics. He would not have received any help from the Republican Party, although he belongs to it, but if I want to reveal my opinion on his behavior, he has to say that he actually represents his own party, his own, so to speak, his own one-man party. As you have correctly judged him, at least as an election campaigner, he is chaotic in his campaign motives and a disaster man. I have to say, however, that he is otherwise good-minded and not bad, including with regard to Russia and Putin, with whom he honestly seeks peaceful political, military, and economic understanding. This is in contrast to Clinton, who has a sneaky and evil idea of war against Russia, and therefore firstly wants to carry out military actions in Syria against the Russian military fighting there and also against Russia itself. A fact in relation to her thoughts of attack which she, as an enemy of Putin and Russia, has long cherished and wants to realize. And if she wins the presidential election, nuclear war would be inevitable. Luckily, that's not going to happen, as I told you on the 30th of June. Of course, the world will be shocked next Wednesday if Trump wins the election, because his way of speaking was and is not the most cultivated. But he has good approaches in various directions that he intends to realize as U.S. president. If he is not worked on by his advisors and those in between who want to direct him power-obsessed according to their scheme, and certainly will in certain things, as has been the case with all U.S. presidents and will continue to be. But if he succeeds, then he will fight against globalization and against the USA interfering too much in foreign countries and thus neglecting order in its own country, but rebuilding it. But the time will show to what extent he can enforce his basic ideas, because besides him there are all those power-obsessed around him, who will not let him act according to his free will, but will try to steer him according to his own discretion, as was also the case with Obama, who lacked the necessary to be able to enforce himself. And because Trump is not a real politician but a man of business and completely disinformed in some things, he will have a difficult position in his own government as president in this respect. This will also be the case with foreign policy, in which the machinations of the EU dictatorship will also be decisive, because once he has taken over the presidency, they will endeavor to win back the close relations and connections to the White House and to the U.S. government lost to him as a result of his election through new negotiations. And as I know, the EU dictatorship will try to pull the USA on its side to form a political, economic, and military power coalition with it, whereby a coalition will be tried very early on. As soon as the first shock is over, which will hit the dictatorship, which expects not Donald Trump but Hillary Clinton to win the election, which is sympathetic and congenial to the EU dictatorship.
We will now see what happens, although I have no doubt that your prediction of June was correct, and that the disaster man or the lesser evil wins the US presidency, Trump. And that would probably also be the discussion of this matter, so I will turn to something else. But what do you think about the new climate conference to be held in Marrakesh? You know that I was there once when I was on the run from Algeria and went to Morocco. Marrakesh is the southern capital, while Fez is the northern capital, but economically both are outstripped by Casablanca. Marrakesh has never really been of political or cultural importance, like Fez, at least until now, when the climate conference is being held. This, if we disregard the fact that Marrakesh has always been a leading trading city and, to my knowledge, has remained so to this day. Marrakesh or Marrakesh means something like the land of Allah in Arabic to my knowledge, but it is also known to me as Red City, respectively Ochre City and Pearl of the South. I also heard the Berber term Durchzugsland when I was in the capital of the prefecture of the same name. The city itself is in the southwest of Morocco and has today, I guess, a little more than 1 million inhabitants.
In answer to your question, I can only say that the whole climate conference is just as absurd as the decisions that are being taken are, because the nonsense of the 2 degrees Celsius thermal reduction, which is intended to stop the problem of global warming, is also completely absurd. All participants of the conference are completely overwhelmed and also stubbornly run into their knowledge, and live in the ridiculous delusion that on the one hand they are knowledgeable, and on the other hand that they know what really needs to be done against the climate change caused by humanity on Earth. The truth is, however, that they are narrow-minded as a whole and either have no idea what caused climate change, the machinations that have long since emerged from overpopulation, or they are so stupid, small and short-thinking that they are unable to recognize reality and its truth. But for a few of these climate conference participants, it is also the case that they know very well that the overpopulation with its criminal machinations of destroying the atmosphere, nature, fauna, and flora has conjured up the climate catastrophe. It really is such a catastrophe. But they do not want to admit this. Especially not in public, because they are cowardly and afraid of being ridiculed by their guild on the one hand, and of losing their influence and field of activity on the other. But overall, all conference topics are apparently not clever enough to know and calculate that during the time estimated, more than 20 years ago, to achieve a ridiculous increase in global warming set at a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius containment, absolutely meaningless and unattainable. And this was and still is the case, because the overpopulation continues to grow inexorably and brings hundreds of millions more people on Earth, who want to satisfy all their needs with regard to consumer goods and luxury, etc., and therefore do not take into consideration that the necessary machinations continue to damage nature. Fauna and flora, all waters, the land, the meadows, pastures, corridors, forests, and the climate as well as the atmosphere. If one considers that since the beginning of the first climate conferences in Geneva in 1979, the total earthly population has increased by more than 4 billion and continues to increase by more than 100 million every year. Even an Earth human who is not particularly mathematically educated can calculate that in 2020, the world population will amount to more than 9 billion. This according to our very accurate records dating from 31.12. 2015, 24, 00 HRS, when 8,634,006,014 Earth humans resided, which is more than 1 billion more than the very inaccurate estimates of Earth's population censuses show. It is a fact that all these Earth humans, as well as all future overcrowding, will cause Earth to be exploited more and more, and Earth's resources to decrease drastically. Furthermore, due to the inexorable growth of the world population, more and more drinking water is needed. As a result, drinking water, which is already extremely scarce in various countries, is becoming scarcer and scarcer because water bodies are drying up or being overused, while other water bodies, such as rivers and seas, are being overloaded with rubbish, causing all kinds of aquatic life, as in lakes, rivers, and brooks, to die just as miserably as poisons are being released into all waters. But the creatures of the waters are also extinct because the masses of terrestrial men rob the seas, rivers, and inland waters of their existence. But they also poison and destroy the habitats of countless life forms of the land. The meadows, fields, meadows, forests, mountains, and the air, whereby thousands of genera and species are irrevocably and irrevocably exterminated.
Unfortunately, there are too many stupid so-called experts, not only among the climate researchers and others who deal with the climate, but everywhere else as well as among the natural scientists, physicists, and earthquake scientists, etc., who not infrequently talk about any idle time, whereby I want to ask something especially concerning earthquakes. But with regard to global warming, I just recently read the following about such a failure, which I copied from the internet.
Should the first hopes be shattered, only one remains. Even a warming of more than 2 degrees does not have too bad consequences. For example, a significant rise in the oceans would be inevitable. Glaciers would melt. Heat waves would increase while cold victims would decrease. But it is still unclear whether storms would be worse, drought areas larger, or how much the ice masses of the poles would shrink.
There one sees clearly the stupidity of the climate experts, whereby I must ask nevertheless, how stupid and simple-minded a human being must be at all, that such nonsense can only be said, because it really does not need much understanding in order to notice and understand what actually goes on and happens on Earth. This is precisely in consideration of the climate change, the atmosphere, the destroyed nature, the polluted and poisoned seas and inland waters, as well as in the same way the forests, fields, meadows, and fields, as you have said, but also the extermination of many genera and species of plants and the terrestrial, air, forest, and corridor and water creatures. But it is not only the climate people who do not understand the whole of the climate catastrophe, but also those who are not intelligent enough to see the effective truth that it is the overpopulation with its machinations that is to blame for the whole disaster with regard to the destruction of nature. Fauna and flora and the climate as well as the atmosphere, the land, the forests, meadows, fields, all seas and inland waters, and the destruction of the atmosphere. This also includes the Austrian Plastic Planet director and documentarist Werner Butti with his claim, "Overpopulation doesn't exist," and his film, "There's No Such Thing as Overpopulation." By 2020, overpopulation on Earth will have risen to over 9 billion people because the population has never increased so rapidly as it has in recent decades. Since Earth has existed, Never before have so many people populated the planet. Now the time has come for mankind to slowly run the risk of destroying Earth through overpopulation, because now it is at the point where it begins to exceed the planet's limit. The only way of exerting a positive influence on this is by means of a specific and time-fixed worldwide birth ban and, in addition, an absolute birth control system that is ordered and controlled by the state. Whereas 2,000 years ago, 198,847,080 humans still lived on Earth, it took 1,500 years for this figure to rise to 2,600,047,000. Today, only around 20 years are needed for this, because since the beginning of the 20th century, the number of the world's population and the birth rate have increased so rapidly that the increase is becoming ever more numerous and faster. As a result, there will be more than 9 billion people in 2020. The unstoppably increasing overpopulation means that a catastrophic scenario will emerge over time. Because the rapidly increasing population means that there will be an increasing demand for energy, food, and space, as well as a further and steadily growing deterioration of the climate. However, neither Earth humans nor the authorities and governments want to recognize this fact and do something about it, so that everything continues within the usual and increasing framework. To do something about what has happened and what is happening at the moment is too late, however, and therefore only something can still be done to stop the current catastrophe in its worst form. The exploitation of increasingly scarce resources, increasing environmental pollution, the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora must be stopped, as must irresponsible population development. It is high time that man consults mind and reason and intervenes in planning to put an end to all the destructive madness and the further breeding of overpopulation. And these processes must not be slow and sluggish. Because just as population growth is subject to its own dynamics, so too is the case with the destruction of the entire planetary habitat of man and of all life forms in general. In nature, there are control mechanisms that prevent the survival of a population and cause its partial or total collapse. Exactly the same can apply to earthly mankind, if it throws enormous quantities of Earth humans simply by epidemics and natural catastrophes from the life and erases. This is the case when the natural course of Mother Earth is disturbed in such a way that every untouched landscape, fauna, flora, and flora, climate and atmosphere as well as oceans and inland waters are largely destroyed. Then nature defends itself for its existence when it is no longer possible for its fauna and flora and the planet itself to continue to exist. Then it drastically reduces humanity by causing gigantic storms, landslides, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, heat and cold waves, devastating sea rises and forest fires, causing the deaths of countless people, as well as epidemics, pandemics, infectious diseases, new diseases, and infectious diseases. The fact is that biology knows only in exceptional cases or with lower forms of life an unchecked growth up to the complete exhaustion of the habitat. So precisely with bacteria and microbes, but not with higher forms of life. Thus, in the animal kingdom, in the world of birds, amphibians, fish, and reptiles, as well as in humans, regulatory strategies have been recognizable since time immemorial by which entire genera and species have been eradicated by nature, so to speak in self-defense, because an overpopulation or overpopulation has arisen. In order to prevent such consequences, which can also spread to earthly mankind, there is only the possibility to reduce earthly mankind in the first step by a 7-year total birth stop in a human and reasonable way. Subsequently, the increase must be further reduced through officially controlled worldwide birth control in order to reach and maintain a planet-compatible human population level. This is the only way to find a solution to the problem of overpopulation and preserve the life of terrestrial humanity, the planet, nature, fauna, and flora, the atmosphere, and an acceptable climate. If this does not happen, then the enormous imbalance between nature, fauna, and flora, atmosphere, climate, and mankind will continue to grow. But the already catastrophic social imbalance, which is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, continues to grow, which is already having devastating consequences in the whole human world, which can already no longer be withstood, and which can therefore no longer be solved sensibly without very drastic measures. But neither the authorities and governments nor the populations of all countries respect this, and as a result, populations are exploding not only in the developing and emerging countries, but also in the industrialized countries, where population growth is also drastically increasing due to refugee flows, as well as due to the very large number of births, which are usually much more frequent among refugees from poor countries than among the natives of the industrialized countries. For example, the many generations and offspring births of developing and emerging countries are transferred by the refugees from these countries to the industrialized countries, which are also overpopulated. Moreover, in these better-off states, the populations are growing unrestrained by tens of thousands of refugees from poor and war-laden countries, with only a certain proportion of the refugees being righteous people who leave their homes because they are threatened with death in them. Another part corresponds only to economic refugees who flee greedily to the industrial nations in order to live off the prosperity offices or to become rich through some machinations, but who could help to build up a good infrastructure in their homeland, or could participate in the construction of a good necessary economic and organizational substructure as a prerequisite for the supply and use of the country, or at least for a certain area. This could greatly benefit the entire economy of the country in question, but these elements would rather flee to better-off countries and increase the social, labor and social conflict potential there, which continues to grow in those countries where this type of refugee is established. Another part of the refugees who creep into the industrialized countries are criminals as well as terrorists who lead an unlawful, thieving, burglary, fraudulent, predatory, or even rapist life, or who bring mischief, death, and destruction on the local people through suicide attacks or other acts of terror. While society in Europe is even shrinking due to persistently low birth rates, developing and emerging countries continue to experience strong offspring growth, which, however, is also being shifted by refugees from these countries to the affluent states that receive these refugees and grant them asylum. Decisions on population and birth control unfortunately hardly exist. If population censuses are ignored in certain industrial states, then the growth of offspring cannot be slowed down either. If, however, such measures were finally created, they could only have an impact in decades to come, because diminishing changes in populations are extremely slow and sluggish in the rhythm of generations. If a comparison is to be made, then an ocean-going ship at full speed can be used, which, if the propulsion is stopped completely, will continue for several kilometers until it really comes to a standstill.
I guess I don't have to say anything else about that.
Again, a question about Donald Trump. You said that the man was good-minded, not bad, and completely disinformed in some things. What does that mean?
He is not stupid and not the bad man, as he will be insulted by his adversaries who will rush against him and also try to make a fuss because they all do not know what deceitful thoughts and plans the opponent Hillary Clinton really has, through which she would cause a worldwide catastrophe if she came to power. And for this nevertheless still to happen, fraudulent machinations will be initiated after the election, aimed at proving allegedly wrong election results, whereby Trump would have iniquitously won his office. However, we have not yet established what will result from this planned fraud, which is why I am not yet able to provide any information. As far as Trump's campaign speeches are concerned, however, these are first of all just battle speeches, which must not be understood in their entirety as effective, because the whole seemingly radical cries of outcry, as you have often called such speeches, can only be taken halfway or not at all seriously, because as a rule they are always relativized after taking office. Moreover, Trump is misinformed about certain things he represents, such as climate change, Obamacare, and others, but there is hope that he will be able to think of something better. This will actually be the case. So he will be instructed and will also refrain from not seriously intended election campaign topics and revise some of the invalidities that correspond in his unintentional election campaign speeches only to platitudes with the purpose of achieving them.
Aha, so that's what you are talking about.
Which I should have explained better.
So what is done, do not make a problem of it. It is only to be hoped that he will not let himself be tapped wide by the world power greed of his advisors and other oppressing people of all colors from various ranks and the dark government, and be tempted to laws, actions and decrees, etc., which are aligned to the traditional USA megalomania style and world domination airs and graces. I would also like to say in general terms that the majority of the so-called government elite of the USA, as well as of all other countries on planet Earth, have nothing to do with an elite, but only with an arrogant, megalomaniac establishment rivet elite, which is boastful, pompous, slanderous, blasé, conceited, condescending, haughty, pompous, boastful, incapable of governing and complacent. All those who belong do nothing good and positive for the people, nothing for their needs and rights, nothing really good for the country, its peace and real freedom, as in this relationship not for the entire populations of Earth and the countries in which they live. And if I had to enumerate which and how many are really good and righteous in these and those supreme governments, if they actually exist, then I can count them on one or at most 2 or 3 fingers per state.
Which unfortunately cannot be denied.
Then I want to ask you something about earthquakes that have been raging in Italy lately. Your father Svath had a list of severe earthquakes and violent volcanic eruptions, which he, as he told me, had prepared according to forecasts up to the year 2100, and also predicted to me various earthquakes and volcanic events that occurred up to the first 10 years at the beginning of the 21st century. But he made me understand, as usual with you with regard to predictions, that I had to keep quiet about it. But now there is a new time after the beginning of the first decade of the millennium, so I would be interested to know what will happen further in this respect, if you may tell me something about it. In Italy, it has just recently crawled again with over 1,000 aftershocks, so I have the question when the next strong earthquake will take place.
As usual, the only way I can tell you this is if I'm sworn to secrecy.
I know that, because fear and panic must be avoided.
Good. I know the list of my father mentioned by you. Of course, also its contents. I follow because I know that the next strong earthquake will not be in Italy, where recently strong earthquakes were, but in 7 days, that is to say on the 13th of November in New Zealand, namely in the area of Christchurch, with a strength of over 7.7 on the Richter scale. Further, in relation to such and other occurrences of nature, I will select from my father's records and report it to you in secrecy on my next visit.
This is violent, but I know from my own experience how earthquakes can cause hell on Earth. But thank you very much for your effort to find out more, but I'm not eager to learn things I don't yet know about my family and our core and passive group members. It is thought, and emotionally as well as psychologically, simply very stressful to predict certain coming evil, bad and negative events, etc. with regard to people, whereby it does not even matter to me whether the predictions concern my family or my core and passive group members connected to me in friendship. Even when it affects people who act as adversaries against me, it hits me and makes me feel compassionate and sad. It is simply not easy to know what is going to happen and to have to remain silent about it. And I would not wish even my worst enemy to know even a part of his own life ahead of him, let alone what will happen with regard to his family and friendships and with regard to world affairs. To simply act ignorantly or even stupidly in relation to foreknowledge is a thing that can lead to evil fear and despair and is very difficult to cope with. Therefore, it is good for people that they cannot look ahead and know nothing about the future, because otherwise they would go mad. Effectively, I think, it is already enough for many that they fall into distress, misery and despair in their thoughts and feelings. If they experience things and events without foreknowledge or experience them themselves, which they cannot cope with and thereby suffer severe psychological or even conscious damages. This is also true with regard to events such as earthquakes, etc., whereby people who do not experience such events themselves can hardly or not at all bear the relevant facts alone and are therefore severely reproached for not doing so themselves. On the other hand, People from industrialized countries who have not traveled the world and who have not experienced earthquakes themselves, or who have not spent time in earthquake-damaged areas directly after earthquakes, cannot imagine what catastrophes such events are. They probably read and see reports and pictures in newspapers and journals, see and hear in the TV news what has happened, but they cannot understand the whole misery and the grief and despair, as well as the real catastrophe. Your father Svath brought me to various countries from 1944 to 1952 at the time of earthquakes, so that I could see how earthquakes destroyed everything, how the people lost their lives, were wounded, beaten with grief, and their houses destroyed. I particularly remembered an experience in 1948, when an earthquake in Turkmenistan claimed more than 100,000 lives, as well as when in 1960 Ascot brought me to Morocco, where I witnessed earthquake and where there were about 13,000 deaths. In total, I have had 8 such experiences together with Svath and Ascot. I don't know exactly anymore because some things I have simply forgotten. But what remained for me were the words of your father Svath. For he said that unfortunately I had to witness all these events because it was about the shaping of my attitude, understanding of psychology and solidarity, etc. with people.
It is good that you can talk about it, because this proves to me, as over and over again, that you have made full use of the teachings of my father and Ascot to develop yourself in every way important to your mission. If that would not have been possible for you, then you would never have been able to begin it, and you would not have been able to bring it as far as it has thrived to this day. All that, and how my father, and later also Ascot, gave you all that was important for teaching and all the possibilities with regard to experiences and the experience of the whole, was inevitable and made you the man who you had become, remained, and still are today. And as far as the experiences and adventures mentioned with regard to earthquakes are concerned, there were not 8 of them, but 12.
But I often had great trouble coping with everything. I had to admit that to Svath when he asked me several times, because all the hard tours that I was expected to do were sometimes, well, talking about it is no good now. So I want to say something that Svath taught me about earthquake things that people normally lack in general education, as I have often found in my life. Many contemporaries in the industrialized countries, which are actually safe from earthquakes, lack knowledge about earthquakes, which is why I want to do, at least for the FIGU members, what your father Svath taught me. Earthquakes occur as a result of 2 conditions. On the one hand, when underground magma masses break through and push upwards and then lead to volcanic eruptions. On the other hand, which corresponds to the actual origin of earthquake, earthquakes occur when earth plates are under great stress and collide in a breaking manner. This creates a so-called geological situation in which earth plates wedge together, drift past each other, rubbing against each other, or turn over each other. The whole thing leads to a tremendous buildup of pressure, which affects Earth's crust, whereby when it can no longer withstand the tensions, it is discharged by elemental jerks, which have the effect of enormous earthquakes. This often happens without large advance warnings coming from Earth's interior. Like water waves, the energy or its force spreads through Earth as enormous oscillation waves, as well as through the atmosphere. If such an elemental jolt occurs, the vibration waves penetrate deep into Earth's interior within seconds on the one hand, but on the other hand also to Earth's surface in a devastating way. A powerful, abrupt pressure discharge occurs with every earthquake, as was the case in Italy with earthquakes of 1980, 2009, and 2012. In Europe, Italy, Iceland, Greece, and Turkey are among the most vulnerable earthquake countries. Earthquakes and volcanoes are among the greatest dangers threatening humanity and the planet from within Earth. With earthquakes and eruptions, as I said before, being a complete surprise and injuring or killing many people, especially in densely populated areas. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions can also cause enormous damage to nature and human achievements, which will be even worse when tsunamis occur. Tsunamis can also occur when earthquakes occur on the mainland, but most often they result from seaquakes that must be specifically designated and named as such, as Svath has explained. This is precisely because there is a difference in the form that earthquakes originate only from the mainland. Sea quakes only in the oceans and large lakes. Consequently, the propagation of vibration waves have other dimensions and also produce other effects. The actual seismic focus is always a certain point in the underground of Earth, whereby this point does not simply correspond to a certain place, but to a larger extent. And if there is talk of an epicenter in an earthquake, then that is the center on Earth's surface that lies exactly above the inner terrestrial Earth. The Richter scale, which is used to measure earthquake intensity, indicates the magnitude of the strength in the actual source of earthquake. Earth's surface is measured with highly sensitive seismographs or seismometers, which is why this science is also called seismology. These devices register ground vibrations from earthquakes or other seismic waves. A seismograph is a device that basically consists of a mass mounted on a spring suspension. Earthquakes are usually caused by fractures in the subsoil of Earth, usually at depths of less than 20 kilometers, although these can rarely be lower. As I said before, they are caused by the fact that different parts of the outer shell of Earth or the lithosphere plates move against each other or over each other, causing friction and vibrations. Particularly at the edges of the different Earth plates colliding and overturning each other, there are elemental vibrations, which trigger enormous jerky discharges and thus relaxations by the movements of the accumulated tensions. In addition to this, it is also possible that geological disturbances may occur inside Earth's plates, which have existed as weak zones for millions of years and can lead to earthquakes. Around the Pacific Ocean, along the north-south line, most severe earthquakes occur at the edges of plates. The African Earth Plate is located in the continent of Africa, as well as in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and in the Mediterranean region, where Europe and large parts of Asia are also located, which is specifically referred to as the Eurasian Earth Plate. These earth plates, which border on each other, which push each other massively, which also turn over each other, lead again and again to destructive, devastating earthquakes, particularly in Morocco, Algeria, in Italy, Greece, and in Turkey. If an earthquake occurs, it is caused by the fact that the ramming, crashing surfaces of Earth's slabs, which are placed over enormous unevennesses and push or break, trigger vibrations or shock waves like in a primeval explosion, which propagate in all directions and can be registered as seismic waves. When strong earthquakes occur, Earth's surface is subject to continuous vibrations that destroy human achievements such as bridges, houses, so-called churches, factories, blocks of flats and high fireplaces, etc., by causing them to collapse through the vibrational forces. Certain earthquakes can even be so powerful and strong that they permanently deform even railway tracks and Earth surfaces, such as when deep earth cracks or terrain levels occur. If there are such direct earthquake consequences, then very often many dead and injured people as well as poverty and misery have to be deplored, just as poverty and psychological damage appear in many people. As a rule, however, indirect and dangerous damage also occurs. For example, if electrical lines are destroyed, poisons escape, spread, and cause a lot of trouble, or if gas lines are destroyed and severe fires are caused by the escaping gases. Effectively, there is no direct protection against earthquakes, nor can they be predicted or prevented due to the lack of earthquake warning technology. People can protect themselves from the consequences only halfway by constructing their houses and all necessary buildings in endangered areas in such a way that they are reasonably earthquake-proof, so that they do not collapse in the event of earthquake vibrations. Also, all conceivably important supply lines, such as electricity, telephone, gas, and water must be installed, laid, and secured against shocks and displacements in such a way that they can withstand even severe shocks and vibrations caused by earthquakes in the best possible way. As I said, this would be an urgent necessity in areas at risk of earthquakes. Such techniques are, however, even in today's time, since residential buildings, etc., could be built somewhat earthquake-proof, as good as not the case, because everything costs too much, and the people lack the necessary money. As I have seen, experienced, with various earthquakes in different southern countries, The houses of the people were so lousy, primitive, and even weather unresistably glued together, of earthquake-proof built, not to mention that even by heavy storm, gusts building materials were torn from the walls and roofs and hurled by the area. So much for what I learned from your father Svath.
Your memory is always amazing to me.
Actually, I do not study old unimportant things, events, experiences, and present unimportant things and things around. Consequently, I do not burden myself with unpleasant things. But if it becomes necessary, then I can rely on my memory, as well as on the memory banks. But I've told you that before.
That's nothing new to me. But now I have something to add to what I said at the beginning of our conversation. Unfortunately, we got away from the actual topic when you raised another one, but it was interesting, so I also wanted to continue it. So what I still have to explain relates to the fact that a change is to take place in the National Group Germany in such a way that, as Karen leaves it and joins the core group in the parent center, it has to be restructured. But because there is currently no suitable leader for the National Group leadership in Germany, we decided in the committee to create a leadership possibility in such a way that you should address Occam and ask him whether he could take over the leadership of the National Group Germany, what he should consider thoroughly. On the one hand, it would be possible if he were able to chair and supervise his study group and the national group at 2 different weekends. On the other hand, as we see it in the committee, both groups could also be merged into one, just as it would also be possible for the study group to be continued by a new chairperson. These solutions must be decided, however, on the one hand by Occam, and on the other hand by the members of both groups, whereby probably also the direct participation of the core group will be necessary, which falls into the task of the KG president and/or the KG actuary. A new meeting place for the national group must also be clarified, because as far as the present is concerned, we do not believe that this is the right thing to do because of unpleasant disturbances. So inform Occam and submit our request to him so that he can consider it.
That will probably take Bernadette by the hand and do it quite quickly. But can I now ask you another time to find me an excerpt from a conversation from earlier times, but this time not from your father Svath, but from Asket and me. This is a conversation with a 40-year-old Russian naval officer with whom I was able to talk in his bunk in a Russian submarine in the 1960s, the translator being Asket. Wasily was the name of the man who was very frightened when Asket and I suddenly stood in his bunk in front of him. I remember that well as his fright when I told him what it was all about. But then he promised that he would do the right thing, after which he thanked Asket and me. The point was that he should refuse an order because your father Svath had explained to me that he had seen through a look at the future that a great threat was arising. Therefore a warning is appropriate to prevent something. It was probably in 1950 that he initiated me into his foresight, and said that I should also inform Asket and discuss with her what could be done to pass on a neutral warning.
I'm aware of what happened, so I know what you're talking about. And it's a good thing you're talking carefully about it. First of all, I know everything from my father's conversation recordings, and secondly, from the 1962 conversation recordings of Asket. However, to talk about it openly in a conversation report would probably not be good, because you, together with Asket, have done something with my father's disclosure of his foresight, which was actually meant to be concealed, because you have prevented something that should not openly become known, because you would be attacked for it and maliciously accused of self-exaltation. It was probably my father's intention that you should seek a direct contact to make a warning, and then you would act as expected by him, but really should not be openly spoken about.
So let us not talk about what happened during the Cuban crisis. All right, that's fine. The whole thing just came to my mind again because of Trump, who wants to establish good relations with Russia and Putin again, against the previous perfidious political U.S. machinations in Clinton, which fortunately was rejected by the majority of the U.S. population, albeit in ignorance of their criminal airs and graces, and therefore prevented another world war. Since the end of the Third World War in 1945, mankind has stood on the brink of another world war about 5 or 6 times, also as a result of misunderstandings.
Whereby several times only the common sense of courageous soldiers or officers could prevent the evil that would otherwise have led to an all-destructive nuclear war.
Unfortunately, however, there are many people who become in bondage to others and dance to their violin because they have no self-initiative and no self-responsibility, and are also too lazy to think about something that is important. Consequently, these kinds of people, and this probably concerns the majority of earthly humanity, can simply be directed around and controlled without them perceiving what they are actually doing, and that they are usually controlled by irresponsible domineering egoists, despots, conscientious objectors, exploiters, and power addicts, and are deceived, lied to and led behind the light in every possible way, into misery of all kinds and into personal bondage or imprisonment, inner discord and dissatisfaction. In my opinion, the majority of earthly humanity is simply uninvolved in everything that does not concern its own personal needs. Of course, man must first and foremost think for himself and act correctly so that he can be himself in good mental, emotional, and physical health in every respect. But he must also think for his fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, and in this respect, everything necessary must be done and acted upon correctly.
Your word in the Earth human's ear, mind, and reason, dear friend.
It may be possible to get into the ear, but whether it then reaches the mind and reason will be questionable, as it has always been with the majority of mankind, for it is only those people who unfortunately form a tiny minority who grasp and work with it in terms of reason and intellect that determine it.
Another word of truth.
When I think about how earthly humanity is dominated by psychopathic egoists and conscientious objectors, as well as by exploitative and misleading religionists, sectarians, and power-obsessed and exploiters of all kinds, because they know the secret of how they can manipulate people, then I am horrified. For my part, I see the matter of the manipulation of men in the way that all irresponsible people of all colors gain the consent of those men through it, and bring them to their side who can direct and control them. And they do this by using people's indifference, lack of intelligence, laziness of thought, and lack of self-decision, as well as their willingness to let themselves be talked into and by gaining their consent. It is these people who simply allow themselves to be persuaded stupidly because their laziness of thought and their lack of initiative prevent them from forming their own opinions, and consequently simply accept and vehemently defend the suggestively conveyed views and opinions of others. Thus, these kinds of people are not themselves capable of making decisions, but stupid puppets of those who can rule over them. And it is these rulers over the majority of earthly mankind who are effectively the true ruling power of the society of the majority of mankind, and who also form a predominant invisible government in the governments, together with secret services and other political governments. The truth is that these various actual governments are controlled by lobbyists, for example, who control many government affairs, electoral guidelines, and state actions, because some of the actual rulers are incapable of doing so themselves, but are only elected government puppets without the necessary government skills, but try to conceal this with grand eloquence or by laboriously collected stupid idioms.
There is nothing I can say about that either, or simply that you hit the nail on the head, as you sometimes tend to say. But now, Edward, I have some things to discuss with you that should not be public.
Of course, because that must also be the case, although I still have a few things that we can only discuss in private.